Hey folks, welcome to Narratives. Narratives is a podcast exploring the ways in which the world is better than in the past, the ways it is worse, and the paths towards a better, more definite vision of the future. I'm your host, Will Jarvis, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and videos at narrativespodcast.com. Today I am joined by Will Eden. Will is currently an entrepreneur in residence and an investor in the biotech space. He studied economics at Dartmouth College and worked as an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York during the financial crisis. After the Fed, Will moved out to the Bay Area and worked for a digital health startup and a personalized medicine startup. He then worked with Peter Thiel for 6 years, leading his personal early-stage biotech venture capital investments team. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Will.
I want to get started with something that's been top of my mind recently. I recently invested in and had a podcast with someone who is building a new cryonics company, and it's focused on pets. The idea is to build out some real infrastructure. So, if we build it out with veterinary hospitals and make it kind of a norm with pets, we can eventually, migrate that to hospitals, and then it can be an option, just like, cremation or getting put in the ground. Cryonics could be a third option instead of like flying out to Arizona and your brain's liquefied in between, right? It's a interesting approach.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about longevity. Where do you think we are right now in terms of longevity research? Do you think we'll hit escape velocity in your lifetime, in my lifetime, or should we be betting more on cryonics and brain preservation?
Right. So I will say, I think that it is possible that it's within our lifetime. But I do think that the field would have to look a little bit different to probably get there.
Gotcha.
I am a little pessimistic on what things look like right now. That said, fields can change very quickly. And I do think that we've hit a tipping point where certain aspects of the aging question are coming into mainstream focus. So, I would highlight things like senolytic drugs and stem cells have really kind of entered the mainstream. And, I do think those are pieces of the whole puzzle. And as soon as you get pieces of it, I think the potential for that to sort of cascade and to hit all of the other areas of aging that we'd have to solve is certainly possible. And I think the main thing that we've needed as a field is something really convincing, right? We do have some interesting studies in rodents, some interesting studies in, much simpler life forms, which don't really resemble humans. And those were stunning enough to get like the research community interested in this question, but we need a clear convincer on a living older human right now, right? Like if you could take someone with like completely white hair and then turn it brown, I think folks would be like, oh, wow, right? Or if you could somehow give them like a drug that just eliminated all of like the wrinkles on their face or something, right? And, obviously I'm suggesting something more cosmetic, but that's the thing that we see all over, right? Like
right.
We see the signs of aging everywhere. We see it on our own face when we look in the mirror. And I don't think a convincer has to be cosmetic, but I think that that's one that would just be like really shocking, right?
Great sales pitch, right? really very legible sales pitch, right?
So that said, I do think that cryo is probably more likely to work in the short term. And by work, I mean we get to a point where the cryopreservation is good enough that we think the brain structure still contains all of the info that was inside someone's head.
Gotcha.
In terms of reviving someone from cryo, that's probably a harder problem than the life extension problem. Not necessarily, but possibly. But I think trying to get the preservation really, really good is probably the easiest problem in that whole space.
Gotcha. So it's just a lot more, to me, at least, it seems a lot more straightforward. Like I think we have a pretty legible roadmap, and we may have one for, longevity as well. I know less about it. I'm curious, do you see it as a talent problem? Is it a money problem? Is it an approach problem?
Oh boy.
Right now, is it all three? I mean, we've seen a lot of capital go into the space, right? In the last like 5 years, but yeah, what's your sense of that?
Yeah, you're asking the $1 trillion question. Yeah, I think different fields are bottlenecked on different things. And with aging, if you take the SENS approach, right, there's like, 7 or 8 things you kind of have to do. And if you miss any one of them, you'll still age and die. And if you basically buy that model, which I don't think is totally crazy, then yeah, the problem is effectively that there hasn't been enough buy-in very broadly, which means you don't get the money and you don't get talent and you don't get the leadership involved, right? And I would say in terms of the biotech space as a whole, before I started investing in the space, I sincerely believed that the bottleneck was something like good ideas.
Interesting.
And sometimes funding when there was a good idea. But now that I am actually investing in the space, it's a lot more often that I see a great idea and I look at the team and the company and the structure and how they're trying to execute that idea. And I think to myself, man, this really isn't going to work. I love the idea, but I don't think that this is going to succeed in its current form. And that's a very hard thing to see. And that's a very hard message to give founders because they really hate to hear that. Right. But like, I do sincerely believe in biotech as a whole, it comes down mostly to talent and leadership holding us back, I would say. Currently in longevity, I don't necessarily think that's true.
Gotcha.
I do still think there are some like paradigm level breakthroughs that probably still have to be done. And most of even the basic research going on isn't really directed at aging, qua aging, right? It's mostly not directed at the fundamental levers that we could possibly, pull here. So that one I think is actually a more complicated problem and isn't just a talent problem.
Gotcha. And on the talent problem, the leadership problem, is that just on the leadership problem, is that a pure management challenge where people just aren't competent managers? And on the talent side, is it that they're just, all the smart people go to work at OpenAI or go into physics or something like that, and there's some weird sorting mechanism going on?
That is one hypothesis, right? I don't fully understand what's going on. Some folks are theorizing that there's just fewer talented and competent folks overall in the world. And there's something about maybe the like education system, something about the system of incentives, something about how things are too like rigid. And it's possible that there are just less people like this overall, period. The other hypothesis is basically the one you're saying, which is there are tons of folks who are very talented, but they're all going into other fields, right? And I do think that there's probably some of both here going on. But, the simple fact of the matter remains, if you're a really talented CEO and founder, right, where can you make the most money the most quickly?
IT.
Probably doing a tech startup.
Yeah.
It's not doing biotech, right? And it's certainly not doing things like building nuclear reactors, right? So I think it has to be at least some of both. I definitely think, given the increase of the world's population, it's shocking that we don't have more like extremely talented people, right? That's very, very weird.
Yeah.
So something systemically is going on that makes them less common, at least as a fraction of like total population.
Well, and it's really weird, right? Because I've got right beside me, I've got one of Jim Flynn's books I've been going through, and IQs in the West have been going up over the last 50 years. Maybe they're leveling off in the last 10. Kind of unclear, but it seems like people have been getting somewhat smarter. Like their pure like horsepower side of things. It seems like people are getting smarter. Yet we do seem to have less Shakespeare's or like true like outside talents now. Do you think things are just kind of getting harder or something like that?
I really don't like that hypothesis.
It's not really a helpful hypothesis at the very least, even if it's true.
Right, exactly. It may be true. And I think certain aspects of it have to be true, right? Because like there obviously are only a fixed number of ways to like put atoms together, right? So like clearly, as you like find more of those combinations, there are fewer of them left.
Right.
But like that isn't to say that we haven't been overlooking something super fundamental either, right? And I do try to think about like, well, what would a true kind of paradigm shift actually look like? Something like the advent of computing. that sort of came out of nowhere. And it's sort of also like tied into like math and other things which were kind of well understood. But like as a paradigm for how to think about the world, that really kind of just overhauled things, right? Like it really was just this very different way of seeing the world. And computation has allowed us to do all kinds of crazy stuff. And, I think that it has been less impactful than a lot of the things that we discovered a century back. But it was still kind of like a ground shattering, just absolute paradigm shift. And it's hard for me to imagine where the next one of those comes from. But I would also be absolutely shocked if we've discovered everything there is to discover either. And if you think about just hypothetically the most efficient use of every atom, we are so far from that point that the idea that we have somehow picked all the low-hanging fruit seems absolutely crazy to me, right? If there were a super smart AI like here with us right now, would they really be like, yeah, you guys picked all the low-hanging fruit. I cannot improve the world anymore.
You've done it all.
No, absolutely not.
Right. Absolutely.
Right? That's absolutely crazy. So from that perspective, I think thinking of it as like, oh, well, everything is just hard now isn't, as you say, very helpful. And I also think that it's not super likely to be true. You can find historical parallels here. So in the like early 20th century, we had invented the steam engines many, many decades back.
Yeah.
And we discovered electricity and we were starting to get like, lights powered by, power, right? And there was this feeling of like, yeah, well, we sort of invented the, obvious low-hanging fruit, right? And that clearly was false. We ended up having this kind of mid-century, and you could argue why that period happened. Maybe it was the Second World War. Maybe it was like the movement of peoples because of the Second World War that sort of brought like ideas somewhere. It could be just that like we were all forced to sort of step up, right? And right. There was just this incredible explosion of tech that I would say that was kind of the last time the world really kind of got fundamentally reshaped. Like if you look at sort of the 1950s onwards, you start to see what looks like the modern world.
Right.
If you look at, pre-World War II, like you can see the sort of very beginnings of that, right? But it was still very, very early. Like we didn't have space flight, right? So for all of those folks back in like the 1920s who thought they'd just discovered all of the low-hanging fruit, they turned out to be completely wrong, right? And can we tell whether we're in, the post-World War II era or the pre, right? And I think that's actually very hard to tell. And I think we could all look back 10 or 20 or 50 years from now and just be like, wow, we were so dumb. There was all of this low-hanging fruit everywhere. And like, I wouldn't be surprised to see that world, right?
Interesting. So do you think like perhaps, and like, this is really difficult to even think about. So like, I don't know how useful the question is, but do you think it's something where people just like aren't trying as hard or maybe just aren't as inspired or something like that?
I think there's something going on there. I do think that adversity can cause humans to really step up in a big way and humanity as a whole. And yet, we also try to seek to minimize adversity in our lives. And I don't even necessarily think that the right thing to do is to increase adversity either. I do know some folks who think like that. They're like, oh, well, modern humans are, weak and soft and we just need some, giant global war to whip us into shape. It's like, okay, but the human consequences of that are just insanely horrible also.
Yeah.
But that said, what could then sort of shake us out of the stupor either, right? And I think some of what we're seeing, certainly now, there's a major war going on in Europe. And it was a war that a lot of people said probably wouldn't happen. And I think the sort of outside view that like nothing ever happens now because we're in the modern era, I think that's been very well falsified. We've had a global pandemic. We have a massive war with one of the world's largest, most populous economies that's now like sanctioned and sort of cut off from the world. This is absolutely crazy stuff. And I feel like if you could, go back to us, 10 or 20 years ago and share some of the stuff that's happened, we would be shocked. I do think it was much easier in, say, the 90s to be like, yeah, history's over, guys. And now I think today it's very hard to actually make that case. So I think there's some chance that like we could be snapped out of our stupor through just events in the world unfolding. That doesn't mean we need to start them. That certainly doesn't mean that we have to make the world worse in order to, change this thing.
So maybe it's something like, we look at Ukraine and what's going on there, and maybe people start to think, wow, like things really can get worse. Maybe we need to work harder to make things better, or something like that.
Something like that. I mean, I think that alone isn't enough to shake people out of complacency. But it's a sign that much bigger things like that could actually happen, right?
Gotcha.
And I do think that having a tighter feedback loop with the physical reality of the world is one of those things that pretty reliably produces progress. Now, maybe that's not the kind of progress we want, right? Maybe the progress we'll make as a result is like killer, drones and like completely autonomous weapons powered by AI or something, right? Like there's horrible things that can happen, right? So I don't necessarily even think war is like the answer, but historically it's been one of those things that has sort of like lit a fire under us as a species to step up. And a lot of those things can then get repurposed after the war also. So I don't think war is always bad, but I do think it's basically always net bad. And so I don't think that is the answer. I guess there's a question of can we produce a sort of cultural psychological shift ourselves, right? Can we do that without any kind of outside force prompting it? I'm relatively optimistic that this is possible. I guess I would have to really think back to what kind of precedents there have been for that. But I do basically believe that if we change our mindset, it is in fact possible to think about the world in a way that makes us much more likely to discover great ideas. And I do think that, unfortunately, we live in this very tightly regulated environment. So I do think that there are headwinds. And I do think that those headwinds will sort of make it less likely for us to sort of purely endogenously make that sort of shift in mindset. And I think it can also make it hard for, funding to actually get to those, truly earth-shattering type projects also. So can we fully do it endogenously without some outside stressor? I do think it's possible, but I do think that that's also going to be a major challenge. And I do think people like Elon Musk, for instance, right?
Yeah.
He's a complex figure like all humans are, but I think that he's doing something important, which is inspiring people with engineering. Right. And
Definitely.
We haven't had those kinds of heroes in our society for a long time. And having examples like Elon Musk that we can all look at, I think is actually one of the things that can start to kind of shape us up as a species.
That's great. And, part of the reason I started this podcast was to talk to people that have found, $20 bills on the sidewalk, and just to kind of put it in the ether that it is possible.
Nice.
There are areas, where you can innovate, like there are things you can do, and just encourage people, like a lot of times the market isn't efficient and, there's not alpha to be had, but, every once in a while you can find things. And I think it's really important to look, especially if you're a smart person. So I'm curious. We've talked a lot about longevity, and I want to talk a little bit more about biotech and how it differs from kind of investing in traditional tech.
Sure.
It seems like it's quite difficult, right? There's a lot more players, and it's a lot more expensive to get through. There's all kinds of complications which we could go through. What has been the biggest challenge for you in investing in biotech? It seems like to me, one of the big challenges is understanding that there's people up the chain you need to sell to as well. So, there's shorter feedback loops in tech where you could go straight to a customer.
Right.
But maybe in biotech, you have to invest in scientists, and then it's got to go to this like contract research organization, and it's got to get through the FDA and on and on and on and on. Have you found that to be the case? And what have been the kind of the toughest challenges to solve for successful biotech companies?
Yeah, it is absolutely true. So I think I'll just start off by saying there's more to biotech than just drugs. And I think for drugs and to a certain degree devices, the dynamic that you're talking about is absolutely true, right? You have a phase 1 trial, you have a phase 2 trial, you have a phase 3 trial. These are real important company events that you have to, actually gear towards, both on the financing side and the team side, and where you focus your science, right? So from that perspective, I basically concur with you that there are these other factors which make it intrinsically more difficult than something like tech, where you can push a button on your computer and everything that was in test gets pushed into deployment. Right. And suddenly, your billion customers are using the code that you just wrote, right? That is absolutely crazy, right? There's no parallel to that in bio whatsoever. And you can envision a future world where you can update some drugs or personalize something, and your desktop printer will produce the exact vaccine. Sure, great. That's a possible future world, but that's not what biotech looks like right now. The other thing I will say, though, is if you're doing a biotech business that is catering to other biotechs, that's much more like a normal company, right? In that you do have customers that you're selling to right away. And some of my absolute best investments have been in companies like that, right? Where you aren't having to cater to the FDA. You can actually sort of push out new technology to all of the biotechs that you're working with, right? So I don't think it's quite as binary outside of the drug space specifically.
Gotcha.
But in terms of drugs, which is one of the things that we care about, yes, it's a very different world, right? Very, very different. And I think there are a few things that make it relevantly different from tech. One of which is that sort of staging, but I think almost more importantly, it's more about the sort of capital requirements of it. It costs a lot of money to even design one antibody and then put that into patients for the very first time, right? Just to get there, you're talking 8-figure checks.
Yikes.
Yeah. So in tech, there's nothing comparable to that. Nothing. And this is basically an artifact of the way that we've chosen to set up our system. And I do think that there could be a very different version of the world, which sort of doesn't involve the FDA looking quite like it does now, right? But I also think that that's a very different world that is going to be very difficult to get to from where we are now. But at the end of the day, if I could wave a magic wand, I would love the FDA to basically certify things as safe, and
just leave the efficacy. It's we're not worried about that.
Yeah.
Just let regular consumer protections kind of handle that.
Yeah, totally. And look, that would obviously also result in a world where a bunch of stuff that's not very good medicine is also being sold, right?
Right.
We already have that in the supplement space.
Right. Oh yeah. Absolutely.
And some people are angry at the supplement space. It's oh, well, it's hard to know what's even in these supplements, and most of them don't do anything. But most of us don't really care, right? It's yeah, I'll take supplements if I feel like it, and I'm not really going to stop someone else from wanting their supplements, right? And we could get into a world where basically pharma looks more like that model. Now, I think there would be, slightly more serious layers between you and just sort of buying heroin off the, counter. But I do think a world where drugs were developed and looked more like supplements is probably a world where we get more drugs. And in the end, if we get more drugs and can try more things, I think we have an ecosystem that is more likely to innovate and actually get new good stuff. Whereas right now, that sort of feedback loop is very, very loose. And what this means is we end up doing a lot of testing drugs in animal models, which partially reflect humans, but also partially don't.
Right.
And so you get this weird situation where a ton of the kind of fundamental R&D is being done in vitro or in animals or even in computer modeling now. And the odds of that stuff translating into a clinically useful drug in humans is just exceptionally low. It's very, very, very low. Again, some models are better than others. If you're testing a antibiotic in another mammal, okay, you probably know pretty much exactly how that will work. If you're trying to test a cancer drug in an animal and then apply that to a human, I mean, good luck, right? The odds of that working are so small, so small.
Just shot in the dark. Is the answer more of challenge trials or something like that?
I think challenge trials would be awesome. obviously you can't do a challenge trial with like, cancer. That would be horrible. We're going to irradiate your whole body and then give you this cancer drug and see if you survive. Exactly. I mean, I guess consenting adults and all that, but I think that world would look horrible. No, I think very few people would actually volunteer for that. But yeah, I mean, look, I do think that the FDA doesn't want to stand in the way of good drugs. And I think that they do very much go out of their way when it comes to orphan diseases.
Interesting.
And that is the one area where you see the most sort of progress in terms of short timelines. All right.
Gotcha.
So if you're treating an orphan disease, you might be from your first human trial to a fully approved drug in as little as like 4 years.
Oh, wow.
Now, mind you, in some other world, maybe that could be, like 1 or 2 years, right? But that's pretty different than the common story, which is, from like coming up with a drug to actually having it in patients worldwide being like 20 years. Unfortunately, that is actually all too common. And that's the kind of thing where I just start to think, I mean, man, could we do this better? Right? I mean, it's tough.
Yeah.
And I do think in this particular case, the fact that we have actually found all of these other drugs already because of the way that we've set up the system, I think that is a larger barrier in biotech than it is in other spaces, right? So if someone wants to make a clone of Facebook, it really just comes down to, do people want to leave Facebook? Does this, new thing have, maybe some slightly better features, or maybe it's just targeted at like a younger demographic or something, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't really have to be intrinsically superior to Facebook to like beat Facebook, right? But the way that the FDA actually sets up these trials is the new drug has to actually beat the old drug, right? It's not just that you can just put out a drug of similar efficacy. You need to actually do better than what's already out there. And I'm kind of like, well, but maybe just put that out and allow us to explore the sort of new space, right? And we might end up finding that there's these weird quirks. I mean, so many drugs were originally approved for something totally different and then got repurposed, right? And so if you're then like, well, for this one indication that you're going for, say some heart drug, well, it's just as good as this existing heart drug. So I think we're not going to say yes. It's like, okay, but you don't know what other purpose that drug might be put to 20 years from now, right? We are repurposing so many things. I think it's actually way better to just throw all this stuff out there.
Absolutely. Well, and you can use it, a lot of physicians use it off label. And you discover all these new things if it's actually in the ether and people can use it, which makes a lot of sense.
And I think the other thing I would point to in terms of how things are getting better is there is an increasing push to allow basically patients with no other option to use experimental therapies. So Congress did pass a right to try bill a few years back. And it does still require there to be a completed phase 1 study. So it's not literally like anyone can go to, a scientist and be like, pump me up, doc.
Let's go.
But the phase 1, at least, I mean, again, that is already a very high bar. We're talking 8 figures, right? But at least that gives this opening for folks to try stuff that at least has some, a bit of kind of human record on it, right? And that's a very far cry from having to wait until something's completed a phase 3 trial and is being marketed and sold, all of that. We're talking a speed up of, many, many years for some of the sort of worst off patients. So I would also definitely highlight that as being, really, really good step. I don't think it's, as far as it could go, but it's a very good step.
Makes sense. And, if you had to pick between the two, would you rather there just be a lot more money in the biotech space, capital flowing in, or is just spending money on lobbying to try and get the FDA to, drop efficacy requirements and just make the process more simple?
I don't know if there's any amount of lobbying that would do that.
Too entrenched.
So, well, look, I think that the way that you need to look at federal regulators is they get heavily punished when things don't go well, and they get no upside when things go right.
Right.
And this is as true of the FDA as it is of the nuclear commission, right? Which hasn't approved anything, or 1 or 2 projects in 40 years, right? So basically every layer of sort of government oversight that you add is just another entire system of people, all of whom are only trying to stop, one of two kinds of errors, right?
Right.
And you can just do that over and over and over, and you can create arbitrarily many of these groups, all of which can veto these projects. And so that's kind of the world that we find ourselves in. That said, a lot of the reason that the FDA has sort of gotten better on the compassionate use thing, and a lot of the reason that they're quicker to approve orphan drugs now, isn't because of lobbying in the traditional sense. It's because of patient advocacy groups. And a lot of the really smart pharma companies are working very closely with these groups because these are actual patients and the families of patients that are basically like appealing to the FDA in a public and very emotional manner.
Right.
Right. And I think generally when folks think of lobbying, it's like, oh, I'm going to pay off some congressmen to, vote for this bill, twirling my mustache. But that's not what these groups are. Right. They're, for the most part, as far as I know, they're not paying anyone. Right. But they're showing up at these meetings every single day. And they're like, hey, you have done nothing for my family member. You have approved 0 drugs that treat, my son, my daughter. Right. And you can only sort of look those people in the eye so many times before you're like,
right.
Yeah, maybe I should approve this one. Now, mind you, we do get things like that Alzheimer's drug where we're very skeptical, that it worked at all. But that is the price. That's the price we pay. We have to let through a couple drugs that don't work in order to let through drugs at all.
Yeah, I was talking to a Biotech M&A lady on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and she talked about how the failure of that drug for Alzheimer's just has ruined like a whole class of drugs that were targeting the space because no one will invest in them anymore because, that one drug didn't work and it was this big Atlantic story and everything.
Yeah, the Alzheimer's space in particular is tough. I definitely think just like every other field, everything is about trends and fashion.
Unfortunately.
Like, oh, there's some target and everyone wants to go after that one target. And that can make sense when it's a really good target. Right. But when it's a very uncertain target and every drug company goes for it, that can destroy entire fields. There are very few companies that are excited to invest in a new Alzheimer's drug.
Right.
Which is incredibly, incredibly sad. And yet that's how the world works. When things just fail over and over and over again, we're just conditioned to then not try.
Definitely. Do you see any of this changing on the capital side? I was talking to Paul Schmelzing at Yale a couple weeks ago. We were talking about the long-term trend of interest rates for the past 800 years.
Yes.
They've been trending down, down to like,
I saw that paper. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking, about why this was, but, long story short, it does seem like interest rates are trending down, hitting 0 right about now. And this seems like this will probably continue to be the case. And so that pushes people up to riskier assets. Venture capital is one of them.
Yeah.
Do you think eventually like just more capital in the space will just help fix and alleviate some of these problems in the long run?
So I'm going to say no. At least from the evidence that we have, when more money goes into venture, it tends to underperform.
It just reduces the returns. It doesn't.
Yeah, which suggests that the fundamental bottleneck isn't actually funding.
Gotcha.
And I suspect that money could be better spent elsewhere. I think the way to think about VC is that it's a high prestige field, which means it's always going to be oversupplied relative to the actual size of the market.
Gotcha.
And if you look at overall VC returns, it generally is somewhat underperforming just owning the S&P 500. There are brief periods where it overperforms, right? There are some, 90s tech companies that have ended up becoming the largest companies in the world. So yeah, you have a couple cohorts that outperform by a lot, but the vast majority of cohorts underperform.
Interesting.
And if you pour more money into that space, it's basically going to push up valuations, and it's not really going to do a whole lot, I think, to increase returns in the space.
Got it. How do you, working in venture capital then, how do you think about finding alpha? Like if there's a lot of capital.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Yeah, is it just like man, it's just very difficult. We just do the best we can, kind of thing, or like what's your answer there?
I think every investor comes up with a set of heuristics that they think allows them to outperform.
Yeah.
And I think some of what makes VC extremely hard is that the feedback loops are very loose. Right.
Gotcha.
So if you invest in a company in the public market, you have a daily P&L.
Right.
And you have to stare at that number. If it's red, if it's green, every single day, which I think is also another failure mode, by the way. It's very hard to invest well when you can see the price every single day. The flip side, though, is what kind of feedback do you get as a VC, right? Well, the company is going to raise another round, maybe in a year, maybe in 2 years, maybe longer. They're going to do that a few times before they go public. It's a very long road before you either A, get your money back, or B, get something like a kind of daily thermometer about how things are actually going. So in that sense, I do basically think most VC investors are using the price of the following round as their
criteria for success.
Yeah, which does create some obviously bad and weird incentives, and that's sort of only a proxy metric for the thing that you actually are trying to do, right? So in that sense, it's very hard. And did you generate alpha? I'll tell you in 10 years whether your strategy generated any alpha. Maybe 15.
At that point, it's just too late. It's just too late.
I mean, it's not too late if you're going to spend your entire life doing VC.
That's true.
Right. So, maybe you have a 50-year-long career if you're, very lucky and you hang on way longer than you actually should. Maybe 10 to 15 years into fine, let's call it a 40-year career, right? Maybe after 10 to 15 years out of your total 40-year career, you'll know if you're actually making money.
That's funny.
I do think that it's not impossible either, right? Like I invested for Peter Thiel. He's one of the great investors in the space. If there's anyone who has proven that they can actually generate alpha, it's him. So can I generate alpha by just copying what he's doing? Maybe. I don't think that's like totally crazy.
Right.
And I do think that I obviously learned a ton from him. I also don't think I'm as good of an investor as he is. So, but if I can get, half of that alpha, I'll still
be happy
actually
with it.
make money, right?
Right. Interesting. Is it just, just at the meta level, is it just looking for things that other people just overlook for some reason, like taboos or things like that, or just, are there any like frameworks you can talk about that help you conceptualize, picking good investments?
So to be fair, I think biotech is a little different than tech, and I don't spend most of my days doing tech stuff. So it's possible that this is maybe a little bit of an unfair characterization, but I sort of feel like you could just take a company's weekly growth rate in tech and just like solely price it based off of that one metric and just get rid of all other VCs, right? And look, I don't think that's actually fair, but I think that that's closer to the mark than I wish were true, maybe. Yeah, I think the one big conceit that all VCs have is that the ideas matter.
Interesting.
And so often, I hate to say it, but the ideas don't actually matter. It's more about the team. It's about the execution. And it's a little bit sort of trite to say that now, but I think even most VCs still haven't internalized how much that's actually true.
Really?
It's just, can this team pull it off? Now, again, I think that's slightly more complicated in biotech, but only by a little. And the reason I say that is most companies in biotech, if they're developing a drug, are bought before the phase 3.
Got it.
Not every time, but most of the time. So yeah, there are some proof points in a phase 1. They're pretty meek. By the phase 2, you probably really should have some sort of, indication that the drug will work, but even then, not always, right? But yeah, I think that has helped to kind of weaken the amount that the sort of ideas and the underlying tech matters. Because if it's bought before you've had to prove it out, then the idea didn't matter, did it?
Right. So is it more just, I guess operational, like managerial excellence and good salesmanship that matters a lot more? Like, can you just,
Sales.
and sales matters a lot?
Sales skill. Seriously, I honest to God think sales is the most important skill a CEO can have. It is the most important skill. And yeah, again, you get a Theranos type situation too, which I will note, by the way, there were no like hardcore biotech investors in that company.
Right.
It was all folks from outside the space who invested in this company. So clearly there's something that we could pick up on, that something wasn't quite right here.
Right.
But that said, there have been plenty of drug companies which, again, were bought after a, possibly successful phase 2. If you sort of squint your eyes and like turn your head and look at it in just the right way, maybe that was a positive phase 2, and that company still got bought. And that comes down to sales. It comes down to sales. It comes down to who you know, networking. And if that's the primary thing that generates early stage returns, that's the primary investment criteria.
Yeah.
Can the CEO do sales? And I'll tell you right now, that's not different between tech and biotech. It's really not.
Well, you bring up a great point. I've always thought that Elon's real skill was that he's just an incredible salesperson. Like, I think he may be a competent engineer. I have no idea. He probably is a very smart person. But I thought his real skill is just his ability to sell. I think he's a really great salesperson.
100%. And quite a few people have pointed that out in the past. But it does seem, though, like, yes, he's good at sales, and he seems to have actually created working products, too.
That's right. It's important.
And those two things are somewhat orthogonal. Arguably, they're even diametrically opposed in some cases. However, he's actually proven himself in a way that a lot of people who are good at sales never have to actually prove themselves.
It's true.
So I think he has earned more respect than he's normally given at this point.
I think you're right.
I do think those were totally fair criticisms, even 5 years ago, but certainly 10 years ago, right? I think that there are other universes where Elon, did blow up the first 3 rockets or 4 rockets or 5 rockets, and he's nobody now.
Didn't quite clear.
Yeah. And that's not the world that we live in. And I'm very glad that it's not. But I do think that there were many cases where he was a sort of hair's breadth from failure and he pulled through.
Well, that brings a great question, up that I've been thinking about. Sorry, it's not on the outline, but, how much do you think chance and luck play in these things?
They obviously play some role. And it's one of those things where for the people who don't have the non-luck factors, they like to play up the luck. And for the people who have the non-luck factors, they like to play down the luck.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah. So clearly there is some luck. And also very clearly, there are a lot of things you can do to stack the deck in your favor. I like to think of it as how much can you load your dice? It's still going to be a roll of the dice. Okay, fine. Right. But maybe your dice have 3 sides that have a 6 on it. And, maybe the others are a 4, a 3, and a 2. like that gets you a much higher average roll. But yeah, is there luck? Yes. But have you changed the expected value? Yes, by a lot.
So it's something where you probably want to act like, it's all under your control. But at the end of the day, at the macro level, the luck is involved. You just want to maximize your expected return as best you can.
Oh, yeah. And I think most entrepreneurs are basically like psychotically deluded about how little luck matters. And I think they have to be.
Right.
And this is also one reason why I'm not super excited to start my own company. Like, I will do it if no one else is doing it and it's a really good idea and I have a pretty high level of certainty. I could be convinced to start a company, but for me, that's this huge hurdle. Whereas for other people, they are just like compelled. They can't not start companies. And those people often are not necessarily the best thinkers in terms of like figuring out what's true and what's not true, but they're much better doers than the people who are trying to figure out what's true and not true. And I'm very glad that those people exist. I think they put themselves through enormous hell. I basically think being an entrepreneur is absolutely hellish and only crazy people do it. And that's fine because those crazy people do exist. And if they didn't, the world would be much worse. But I'm also not so self-deluded to think that I could be one of those people and stick it through even when things obviously weren't going well.
Well, I want to tell you this quick anecdote. Coming out of college, helped create this company with three other friends. We sold it 5 years later, and week before the pandemic. And we were doing a retrospective. This was a couple months ago with one of my friends, and we realized there was probably 12 separate occasions where we thought it was greater than 75% chance that we were going to fail week to week. And we're like, wow, like Jesus, like the odds on that are like not good. Like we were so stupid. Like we should have just like stopped. Like each of these occasions, like it was like clearly, I don't know, like you just kind of somehow figure out some way. If you were just kind of somewhat deluded, I suppose is probably the best way to look at it.
And then how successful were you?
We did okay. We did okay. It wasn't a huge success. It wasn't a failure, but it was like just very median kind of outcome, a little bit above median, I would say, not life changing, but a really good experience and a great lesson, I would say.
Oh, totally.
Which was very interesting. Very interesting. Which brings up a question I wanted to ask, which is, how do you think people can kind of get better at thinking? It's clear like people can get better, like, they can get more fit. We can kind of self-improve in all these different areas. But do you think people can kind of like self-improve in the area of thinking about things and being rational?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, of course. It's like any other skill. You can obviously train it.
That's awesome.
Now, my caveat, however, is that returns to thinking are probably widely different across people and what they're trying to do. So if you meet a high-level poker player, they're incredibly rational in terms of doing things like calculating expected value, right? They have gotten very good at that, and they've trained themselves to do that. Because if you don't do that, you systematically get money drained out of your pockets.
Right. It's kind of important.
So in that sense, they face this very steep curve where you either get really good at a certain kind of thinking or you lose all of your money. And in any environment like that, there are so many like strong incentives to learn that you're going to improve your thinking or you're not going to stay in that field. And I would argue this is true of like finance too. If you're this like crazy over emotional swing trader, and you're like, oh, it's going up, I'm going to buy. Oh, it's going down, I'm selling. And very, very quickly, you'll soon learn that you lose all of your money. And almost everyone who actively trades has some period where they all admit they were just totally stupid. But you can learn to manage your emotions. You can learn to be systematic, right? You can learn to have heuristics that work, 52% of the time, right? And that sort of thing, you can obviously improve on and make gains. But what fraction of people are in that kind of situation where you have to improve your thinking skills in order to do better at life?
Not many. It seems like not many.
I would argue that it's actually not that many. Yeah. So do you want to improve your thinking skills? I think the answer is sort of like entrepreneurs. Are you compelled to do so? Is there no world in which you wouldn't improve your thinking skills? In which case, go ahead and do it, and you can absolutely do it. If you're a normal, sane human being, how much is that really going to help your life? Maybe some here and there, right? But I think not. It isn't going to be profoundly life-changing either.
Gotcha. So there's just like not that much incentive for most people to get better, really.
Yeah.
It's probably what's going on. So, and what does getting better look like? Is it just like recognizing like biases, cognitive biases, that kind of thing? Or what do you think that looks like?
Yeah. I mean, the actual answer is probably that it's a lot of different subskills. I do think that learning to recognize cognitive biases is actually very, very helpful. I have personally spent a lot of time investing in doing that, and I feel like it has been very helpful for me. But I think that there are other kind of broader subskills too, like just learning to do really well at introspecting on what's going on inside your own head. That does help with things like noticing a cognitive bias, but I'd almost say just things like having good relationships with people can really, really benefit from that. And that's not exactly what most people mean by improving your thinking, but it is effectively a cognitive subskill that will affect every other area of your life. If you can figure out what's going on in your head and you can figure out what's going on in someone else's head and you can talk to them about what's going on, sometimes you can actually fix problems that otherwise would sort of go unnoticed and just sort of sit there and fester. So is that improving your thinking? Well, that's not what people usually mean by that, but I'd argue that it's almost more important in some way.
Definitely. It's super interesting. But Tyler Cowen has this phrase that knowledge workers should have something like scales they practice every day. Do you think people who try and get better at their thinking should have some kind of skills they practice on a daily basis to kind of try and get better at it?
Yeah. I mean, within the rationality community, I'd say betting on the prediction markets is a sort of way of, staying at least somewhat calibrated. Most people aren't weighing in on so many markets so often, but at least it's a sort of baseline check. And I do like that there's a little bit of a culture of challenging each other to bets. It's like, okay, well, you think something strongly, I think something strongly. They're not anywhere close to each other. Let's turn it into an actionable bet. Let's turn it into some observable thing about the world. And I think just having that as a cultural norm keeps people a little bit saner, actually. And it does keep them a little bit more in touch with okay, am I modeling the world well? Is this subjective probability that I have in my head reflective of actual probability of something happening? Some folks explicitly do calibration exercises, and I think that's useful to do every now and then, largely, again, to just translate the subjective feeling of a probability in your head into an actual probability that corresponds to something that you can check. Very good to do that sometimes, or even just once. But is that necessarily going to keep you sharp? I think it's tough to do it with sort of stylized things like that.
Got it. So, you started work, you worked at the Federal Reserve, econ major, you became a biotech investor, investing in longevity. Were there anything you explicitly practiced along the way, getting up to skill in biology, in longevity? Was it just reading a ton of papers and getting the lay of the land? How did you think about that? Just that was it, just the academic papers, that's the best way to do it.
Yeah. So I would say that there's a skill in how biology works generally. There's a lot of specific facts about biology. And then there's the skill of becoming a good investor. And I think all three of those I learned separately.
Interesting.
So I would say that my journey basically started towards the end of college. And I was really reflecting on what I wanted to do with my life. And basically the answer that I got back, if I could, would basically to be stopping sickness and death and suffering. Right? Just I was looking around me and seeing my parents and my step-parents falling apart at the seams, and other people who had just mysterious health conditions. Just tons of people that just can't lose weight. Right? It's everywhere. If you look around, ill health is everywhere. And it was just eating at me. I was I want to do something to try to help this. And so what I ended up doing is I started with myself. I was all right, I'm just going to try to answer some really basic questions. What should I do for diet and exercise? And so I started to read the literature, and I was okay, this is a total mess. Yes. We have no idea. The studies are done super poorly. And I do think having a background in econ really helped here, because I was actually literate enough in stats to sometimes just see these things and be that doesn't really mean what you think it means. That isn't good evidence for this claim you're making. This doesn't make sense. And then everyone's citing this bad paper. I'm well, I can't trust those papers. It just got,
whole branch
total mess. But I think the other thing too is there's a way of thinking about complex systems, which I picked up in econ, not from my classes, but from actually learning fundamental economics from, folks like Hayek and Smith, right? There is this way of seeing the world as a complex system. And I immediately could see the same things going on in the body. And once I could sort of port over some of that just general way of thinking, that actual systems level thinking, the whole body started making a lot more sense.
That's cool.
And so in a weird way, my background outside of bio, I think actually prepared me really well to teach myself more bio. So that kicked off the phase of me just like reading everything and just following every rabbit hole I got down. I was like, okay, so I'm interested in nutrition. So like, how are different foods digested? And like, oh, it just turns into like, fats, proteins, carbs, and they're like in the bloodstream and then they get metabolized. How do they do that? Oh, it's going into the mitochondria. I'm like, oh, the mitochondria. So how does that thing work? I'm like, oh, this thing's really linked to cancer. Now I have to read every paper on cancer. And I just did that. And I read thousands of journal papers. And it's tough because a lot of people ask me like, oh, I would like to get started in bio. Can you suggest something for me to start with? I'm like, no, I can't actually. My knowledge is compiled from just reading so much, hours daily for years. I didn't have a single source. I didn't have like one textbook where I'm like, oh yeah, you should like definitely check that out because that totally makes sense. I have no idea where someone should start. I just sort of jumped into it with both feet and I'm here now. And I feel bad because I want to give people good advice, but I actually don't have it. Like I just put in the thousands of hours necessary to become an expert in the space. And it's very hard to shortcut that part, right? I do think I was able to shortcut the like way of thinking, and I was able to shortcut knowing whether a study looks good or not. I was not able to shortcut learning the facts of biology. There's so many proteins, so many different molecules floating around, so many drugs, so many systems, and all of that just takes time to learn.
Very cool.
Then there's the becoming an actual investor piece, which I did much later, right? So I got interested in bio years before I ever even considered investing in the space. I'm honestly just incredibly grateful for Peter in that he gave me the opportunity to do this. I wasn't an investor before I worked for him, but he knew that I had this knowledge base and he knew that I could focus on it as a specialist. And, I teamed up with some other folks internally and we just sort of did it. And, it really was a case of, asking for forgiveness instead of asking for permission. And I look back on those first few companies that I suggested and they are so bad. And how I was thinking of them was so terrible. I am shocked that he didn't laugh me out of the room or scream me out of the room because it was so bad, right? And that was true of many of the first companies. But eventually we started to actually hit on something. And then we started to see some of these outcomes, did they get up rounds? How high? How soon, right? We started to see, okay, were they able to execute or not? And not just on companies that we did invest in. Something that I think everyone should do is they should keep a shadow portfolio. Look at all the things you seriously considered but didn't invest in, and look at how all of those did and why. And some of those shadow portfolio companies did it incredibly well, which is always very, very painful.
That's brutal.
But in terms of training yourself to think, especially when there isn't that tight feedback loop,
you need as much as you can.
In early stage companies, get a bigger data set. Don't just follow the companies you invested in. Follow the companies you almost invested in, because that's the closest thing you have to a control group. It's not perfect because obviously you were choosing which ones to invest in and not invest in. But if it's close, it was close for a reason. It was close because it almost hit all the heuristics, but not quite. And that can help you see, okay, which things actually turned out to be pretty important and which things really didn't.
Very cool. One common theme I see just in you learning biology and about longevity is, you were just really intellectually curious about it to the point where this is something you're going to do kind of no matter what, right? You're just going to go out there, read the papers,
absolutely,
have fun doing it. It's not like you were sitting there and forcing yourself every day. I'm assuming to
I want to learn biology. No, it never felt like that ever.
Which probably seems like really important part of being successful in it. At least it's it's just, if you're trying to force that to happen, it probably wouldn't work as well or something like that.
Yeah, I do agree. I basically think for developing something like that in your kind of spare time, I basically think you have to be deeply intrinsically motivated. If you're doing it as your job, if for some reason, right now you're plunked into a lab and you had no choice, you're you have to become a scientist. I'm pretty sure you would find a way to do it, in the 40 hours per week you would spend on it, and then you'd go do something else, right? So I do think that it is possible to develop expertise deliberately, but I don't think that that's going to get you the passion to do it in your spare time, right? You have to actually be motivated to do it, which also sort of like ties into how we think about how to parent. Like we are actually unschooling our kids. We just wait to see what they show some intrinsic interest in, and then we like pour fuel on that fire, right? And it can be almost anything. It can be totally random stuff. But some of our thinking there is like, well, they're not really going to want to go deep on it. They're not going to stick with it. They're not going to really develop excellence in it if we're forcing them to do it. We have to wait for them to show the interest and then help fulfill that interest as much as we humanly possibly can. And I basically think you can do that to yourself, right? You can look at the thing that you actually want to be doing. And I think it's tough because a lot of people tell you to turn your hobby into your job. And I think that's hard on multiple angles. I mean, one is not all hobbies can be turned into jobs.
Right.
And I think that advice is sort of causing a lot of people to just become more unhappy with like their actual job.
Right.
Yeah, I am very hesitant to give people advice that I don't think can be sort of universally applied or sort of always successful if you follow it. So I'm not going to tell you to turn your hobby into a job. But if you want to be intrinsically motivated to get very good at something with those, hours that you have left in the day, it's basically a necessary condition.
Makes sense.
Right. So you might not always be able to turn your hobby into your job, but if you want your hobby to become your job, you have to be pretty interested and pretty motivated to do it.
That makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think that's very good advice, and that you're not like sending people down any rabbit holes, but it's like this is like a good path if there's something well aligned with what you're interested in, and you spend a lot of time working on it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a thing I personally struggle with is how to know when to go into a highly competitive, prestige-driven field, right? Like, how should someone tell whether they should try to become a movie star?
Right.
And I don't have a good answer for that question, because ultimately you kind of have to try it and see if you get some traction.
Right.
And sticking with it in an almost like psychopathic way is probably necessary, other than a few, incredibly lucky random breaks, but like really sticking with it and just trying and like doing those like small gigs and stuff. But yeah, it's tough because I would personally tell basically every friend I have, don't try to do that. That seems crazy.
Right.
And yet the movie stars come from somewhere.
Yes.
So maybe it is like being an entrepreneur, right? Don't go into these fields, which are, extremely hard to ever make any progress in unless you are just intrinsically motivated to bash your head up against the wall forever and possibly just ruin your life because you focused on something totally fruitless. Right? That feels like terrible advice to give to someone. And yet you need people who sort of come out the other end of this, right? Like a shockingly huge fraction of kids want to be a YouTube content creator.
Right.
How many of those are there in the world? And then how many kids want to be them? And then run that math. So like, well, what advice should I give my kid now? Okay, so you want to be a YouTube content creator. What should I even tell you? Like,
right. We don't. Well, this reminds me. I have a good friend. He talks about this a lot, and he says, one of the things that people miss is, kids will come to him. He's a school teacher,
yeah,
and ask him what they want to be, and they're like, "Well, I want to be an NBA star." It's like, well, like, yeah, but like, why do you want to be an NBA star? He's like, well, like, actually, like, I like money. I want a lot of money. Like, I could care less about basketball, but I know NBA players have money. So I wonder if, like, in these surveys, it's like,
yes, you can goal factor.
Star. Yeah, it's like really just like
improve your thinking and then goal factor. Yeah,
exactly. Maybe the goal, like, because maybe it's just like people are glomming on to like some other aspect, and that's just a popular choice. But who knows?
I think it's tough if the thing that they're glomming onto is the fame.
Right, fame.
Because fame is really pretty zero sum.
Fame's bad.
Money is not zero sum. Fame is pretty zero sum.
Fame is pretty bad. You want to avoid that.
I would say any field that involves drawing people's attention away from something else they're doing to your thing is going to be intrinsically very difficult, including podcasts, by the way.
It's true. It's true. I would, if you want to make money or be seen or anything like this, I would not recommend podcasting. It's not a good way. The only reason I started the podcast is to be able to talk to people like you, Will, which would have no access to otherwise, essentially. It's really an excuse for me to learn from people. And for that, it's great. But if you want to go out and like try and make money or things like that, I think it's a very poor choice. many other ways to spend your time that are better.
So it's funny. I first started thinking about doing a podcast. Man, I had an old Facebook post about this. I want to say it was 8 or 9 years ago. And I just asked people, hey, would folks be interested in a podcast that was just two people having a really interesting conversation? And it turns out this is one of like the biggest markets for podcasts ever. I mean, Joe Rogan is just two people sitting down having a good conversation.
Very bizarre.
And the amount of pushback I got was actually pretty surprising. There were several people who were like, yeah, that actually does sound kind of cool. I would like that. But the number of folks who came back being like, no, you need this like, tight content thing or super boring. And it has to be super edited and tight and scripted. And I was kind of like, are you sure? But I didn't have enough conviction, right? Because at the time I thought the podcast space was too crowded.
Interesting.
Well, how crowded is it today? Right?
Exactly.
Like if I'd actually started back then, I think there's a decent chance that just having interesting conversations would have caught on and I could have been some sort of podcaster. And that still to this day, I'm like, maybe I should start a podcast. It's like, well, but it's an even worse time now.
Very interesting space. I got to say, yeah, but I do highly recommend it. If you want to have interesting conversation and learn from people, it's a great method to do that from. But it's not a great way to like try and go out and make a lot of money or something like that. Many serious ways.
Yeah, I mean, I did honestly try to think like, okay, if I did start a podcast, I wouldn't expect to become rich or famous necessarily. It's like, what actually was my sort of success criterion for that? And I was basically like, yeah, if the right 10,000 people listened to it and liked it, I'd be very happy with that. And I think the trick there, though, is to get to the right 10,000 people, you actually have to get to like 1 million plus people and then randomly hit those, 10,000 that you actually want to have listened to the podcast.
You know what? I would almost push back on that a little bit because I have had actually a lot of success. Like I love my audience is like the exact type of people that I would like to connect with for some reason. I don't know why. I guess it's just,
sure.
But I think it's because I only contact people I'm reading or I find interesting. Like it is exactly that. Like I do not look at like who's popular or anything like that. I think if you tried to do that, it wouldn't really work.
Yeah.
But if you do just follow your obscure interests, like I think you can attract that kind of audience.
Well, I have a couple thoughts on that. I mean, one is if you're thinking of a niche to dominate, I think you can totally make a podcast that is very popular within a certain sort of subgroup in our culture.
Yeah.
And I basically think that you have succeeded at that.
Thanks, man.
And there's a question of, okay, then can a podcast kind of like break out of a particular niche?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And one answer is you don't actually need to, right? Like you have hit your goals with this podcast. So it doesn't actually have to be more popular because the people that you care about are hearing it. And you did that because you're targeting a particular kind of person. But I do think that in terms of doing like the stag hunting thing and like trying to get famous people on the podcast, I do think even for a podcast that's targeting a niche, it is still actually pretty useful just from a marketing perspective. Saying, hey, look at the awesome people that I've had on this podcast. Because those folks have fans who will listen to all of their stuff no matter what, and they'll discover your podcast. 1. 2, it's easier to get the intros. If you're like, hey, I've had X, Y, and Z on my podcast. Would you also like to be on it? Because it gives you this level of social proof. And so I do think we shouldn't be seeking out famous people to be on our podcasts, but having famous people on a podcast does not hurt. It actually does help.
It definitely does. And that's, you mentioned social proof, and that's one of the very weird benefits that it does give you is, like there's some weird linkage people get when you say, I reach out to people, I say, hey, I've talked to these people, and they're like, wow, like I like them. And, people are much more likely to say yes that way. I don't know. Humans are very like status driven or something like that. I don't know. Kind of disturbing at some level.
Yes and no. I think some of it is status driven, though I think a lot of it is we live in this very busy, complicated, crowded world.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
You need some method of sorting, right?
Yeah.
You need some method of rapidly separating signal from noise. And anything that is a hard to fake signal is really useful for that. And being able to point to a podcast, be like, hey, I interviewed important person X for 2 hours. That's really helpful because it it is a very hard to fake signal that important person X thought you were important enough to give 2 hours to.
That's a really great point.
And I think that among nerdier type people, we really hate costly signaling because it feels like we should be able to just like tell people the truth. And then we don't have to pay this horrible cost. And the signaling feels really dirty. And yeah, it's often this like status-based thing, like, ugh, gross, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about it from a search and a like information theory perspective, on some level, you have to get signal from noise. You have to. And the costliness of the signal is part of what makes it a valuable signal. And those are inseparable. Those are absolutely inseparable. And I think it's better if folks like us really learn that lesson and internalize it up front, because then we can get comfortable with the fact that, yeah, sometimes you have to pay these weird social costs, but you get incredible benefits because you are conveying credible information to other people in the world. That's one of the most important things you can do.
You know, man, well, I really appreciate that because, okay, I want to tell this anecdote really quick. My friend Lars and I, we won an ACX grant this last December for some of our work on land value taxes. And it just opened up like a whole new cadre of guests. And it was kind of like a black pill because I was like, man, I haven't done anything like different, now until like I just get this one signal. It's like, man, if I had a Harvard degree, is this the same thing? Like, man, this is kind of annoying that the world works this way. But I think the way you painted that is like, it's a really good way to look at it, right? It's like, it just, people have very little time to evaluate. And it's just like, you have to take shortcuts where you can. And it's an easy way to do that.
Yeah. And frankly, we are all born into this world as helpless newborn infants who cannot do literally anything. Right. Everyone's entire life is bootstrapping.
Yep. Even
from the very first, like, get the visual system online, learn how to move my arms. Like, even if you're born rich, you still have to bootstrap basic human functionality. So, and I think that we actually just have to be okay with that. And we have to be more patient with ourselves and others and accept that to a certain degree, we all have something to prove. Everyone, no matter what, has something to prove. And that's hard and that sucks sometimes, but that's part of life.
Yep. That's the way it is. It's that's really well put. Well, this is a great transition to parenting.
Sure.
You've got a lot of really interesting thoughts on the subject. Some of the things you mentioned earlier in the podcast reminded me of, we talked to Tommy Collison. He's one of the Collison brothers a while back. And we were talking about his childhood. And it was very much like, his parents just encouraged him to kind of go after like whatever he found interested and really enabled him to do that, which I really found like awesome because I see around me everyone trying to get their kids into the competitive preschools and, so they get into the right college. Yeah. It's just like really like insanity, just like seems like a really bad idea to do that. So how have you approached parenting, and how much do you think parenting matters at the end of the day if you're not kind of actively screwing up kids?
Oh man, that is a huge and extremely contentious subject of which many books have been written.
No small questions here.
I mean, look, maybe I'm as delusional as the entrepreneur who assumes that he'll succeed no matter what, but I basically believe that my parenting matters. There are studies that will try to show you that's not true. I think that those studies try to prove a little bit too much, but I think it's probably one of those things where the people who thinks it's like all genetics plus randomness is, understating the effect of parenting, and most parents are overstating it. And I do have a couple of essays on my blog on this subject where I've tried to actually get into studies which try to get at this question. Most of these are using heritability estimates. So you take, identical versus non-identical twins raised separately versus raised in the same household. And then you can sort of decompose that variance into genetics, shared environment, and non-shared environment. And I've never really loved this approach because you're not directly measuring anything. It's basically like statistical trick.
Gotcha.
And it is a statistical trick that, to be fair, does have some value. And I think that is particularly helpful for trying to back out how much of stuff is actually genetic. Because I do think almost everyone is underplaying how important your genetics and your partners are in the outcome of your kids. And I know no one wants to think anything is like predestined, and it's really not. But again, you're sort of loading those dice.
Right.
And I really do think folks should, at least give non-zero amount of thought to like the genetics of the person that they want to settle down with. That's, not directly how we choose our partners, but I think subtly, right? I think we are sort of
thinking about this
selecting on that. But I do think, for folks who like, especially folks who want kids and want a lot of kids, it's at least a factor we should be thinking about a little more. And you see it coming up with like preventing genetic diseases, which makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're both carriers for something, that's a huge issue for the child. But I do think just, in general, it matters. And I think the heritability studies are good at pointing out that it does matter. Those studies also do show which things matter more than others. If you're talking about your height, it's mostly genetic, quite frankly. And if it's health stuff, it's actually partly genetic, certainly the, propensity towards certain types of health problems are. Once you start getting into the social variables, you actually do start to see the genetic component go down, and you see the shared environment go from, 0 to something more significant. Fundamentally, I don't like how the shared environment and the non-shared environment are separated in these studies.
Seems like tough to demarcate.
Yeah, I have two complaints. One is about the shared environment and one is about the non-shared. And my complaint about the non-shared environment is basically that I know that all parents like to pretend that they treat their children the same, but they really don't. And just because two kids were born into the same household, I think doesn't mean that they got parented the same at all. There are then like arguments like, okay, but then there still should be something that shows up in the shared environment. Okay, sure, fine. But like, if you actually just look at an object level, how parents interact with their kids, it's very, very different. So it isn't a priori obvious to me that the shared environment component should actually be catching the effect of parenting. But then the other problem with the shared environment is it basically makes no sense for the shared environment to appear to be virtually zero, because the shared environment isn't just your parents, right? It's the house that you grew up in. Does the house that you grew up in have lead paint?
The big one.
Like, okay, why doesn't that show up then as a shared environment effect on IQ? If lead has any effect on IQ and lead differs area to area, why doesn't that show up? Why shouldn't the kids raised together have lower IQ then, right?
Yeah.
So the very fact that the shared environment isn't showing up, known environmental things like toxins, right? Like, you start to then wonder, okay, well then why? What is this thing actually measuring? It sure seems like it's just some weird statistical artifact and not really the actual sort of thing that we care about if it's not catching known environmental factors that are shared between the people that you're studying. And then I think the final criticism of these heritability studies is they're really only well defined within a population. So if you could do some RCT where you take twins and one of them is raised in, let's say, the Congo, and one of them is raised in Norway, well, there are basically 0 RCTs that do this, right? However, could you make any case that the shared environment on those two people's life outcomes should be 0? That makes absolutely no sense to me. Like, what if the other person dies of a tropical disease that they could have been treated for in Norway, right? Can they possibly become a successful multi-billion-dollar entrepreneur? It seems much more likely that's going to happen in Norway, even if these kids are genetically the same. So if you actually could take a sort of global heritability estimate, the shared environment factor has to be absolutely massive. And the pushback on that is basically like, okay, sure, that's true. But what you care about is sort of how much you're affecting your kids' outcomes within like whether you live in the US. Right? It's like, we're not actually going to, go then like take one of our kids and like give them to someone, to raise in, I don't know, Afghanistan or something. Like, no one's actually going to do that. So maybe what the heritability estimate is telling you is how much each of these factors matter within the context in which you are embedded. And I do think that that's true. And it comes down to, on average, half genetics and half everything else. How much of that is parenting? We don't really know. I think some of it is parenting. I don't think it's 0. It also feels weird to me because a lot of these people who say that like parents shouldn't matter or sort of don't matter, a lot of them also somehow seem to believe that like having a great professor in college matters or things like that. and these real inconsistencies of like, okay, so you're telling me the person you spent the most hours of your life with has less effect than this like basically incidental contact that you had for like a year of school or something? Really?
Very bizarre.
How does that make any sense whatsoever? So yeah, I think at least with those people, they sort of acknowledge if you're going to do a kind of like weird homeschooling thing where you have a large number of kids and your family's pretty insular and you're doing something sort of weirdly different than the general population, okay, maybe then you have sort of opted into some weird edge case where maybe parenting matters. Like, okay, I mean, in fairness, that's closer to us, right? I am just personally pretty strongly against sending kids to school.
School's pretty bad.
Like, I understand that for some people that is an absolute necessity, but I think for a lot of people, they're choosing to do it. And yeah, in that case, yes, you're handing over some of the most critical years of influence to someone else, to some effectively stranger, and to some group of, 30 kids who you didn't choose or pick or like. And I basically think parents try to do a proxy version of this by sort of choosing which school district they live in.
Yeah.
That's a huge game here. It's a huge game. And I just look at all of that and I think, man, I look at the world today and I think, do I want my kids to be more like the mainstream or less like the mainstream? And for me, that's an extremely easy choice.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
My hesitancy is zero.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And what has your approach been like? Has it been just kind of unschooling? Has it been like encouraging, your children's interests as they come up? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, because like I do think it's tough because as children we start with zero knowledge of the world,
right?
And so there are probably hypothetical interests they would have that they've never been exposed to and they don't know to ask for. So I think one of my jobs as a parent is to expose them to a wide range of stuff. Very, very wide range. Even things they don't necessarily think they would like at first. If they're up for trying something, I'm usually like, yeah, we should try it at least once, maybe twice. And I do think just giving them that broad base is really helpful, if nothing else, to just identify what things they're going to want to do later. I always wish that I were doing more of this on the margin, Every day is busy. There's always things going on.
Right.
I always inside myself wish I were giving them a more varied experience. And I actually wanted to like take them on a trip to Europe in the spring of 2020. This turned out to not be possible. Right. There were travel restrictions and COVID happened, which was not the thing when I was planning it in 2019. So certainly there are lots of kind of missed opportunities there. But I really try to see that as my job, to just expose them to a wider range of things, and I'll say they're fairly savvy kids and they're pretty good at finding out that stuff does exist without my help too. But yeah, I think that is one of the major pillars. And then once you actually find out what they're interested in, then I think my sort of second obligation is to try to sort of give them as much of that as they want to sort of soak up.
Got it.
So even though I went to schools as a kid myself, when I think about what I was like really interested in and spent my time trying to learn, like I was really into math. And I was always way beyond the math that was being taught in the grade level that I nominally was in. And I was just sort of doing math on my own for fun. And similarly, I never took a course on like programming, but I started looking at textbooks and I started just looking at other people's code online. I started to tweak things. And so a lot of the sort of actual enduring knowledge in my life has just come from this independent exploration. And when I look at that, and then I think about how much time I spent in school, it feels like this enormous travesty that I wasted so much of my time. And yeah, sure, there were valuable snippets here and there. And I liked having, friends and stuff, which you totally get outside of school. But like, I do think overall that time was mostly wasted. And I want as little as possible to waste my kids' time. So see what they're interested in and then immerse them in it as much as they can handle and they want, right? And that can take any number of different forms and it can be incredibly weird stuff. it sort of doesn't matter. The idea is to preserve that intrinsic curiosity that drives them to excel in a particular subfield.
Makes a lot of sense. It seems like, perhaps it's something that's missing. Perhaps it's part of the equation that's missing with our lack of Shakespeare's today. And true experts is like people just aren't given the time young enough to explore these things. Too regimented.
Yeah, totally. And there's a great essay by Eric Weinstein on The Edge, where he talks about the pursuit of excellence. And we have excellence crowding out true genius. And I think there's basically something like that going on, where everyone is so driven to sort of do well on the test that becomes their entire world. And that really worries me. I actually think that push is responsible for stifling so much interesting stuff that could be happening. At the same time, I do think that for a lot of people, if they don't have some kind of overarching interest like that, and they don't have the sort of drive and interest and ability to do that, I do think taking a standardized test and trying to get into as good of a school as you can is a useful signal. Whether we like it or not, that's still a good, costly signal. Someone who went to Harvard, frankly, probably has demonstrated more attributes of likelihood future success than someone who goes to, random community college. And I think we don't want to admit that because it feels yucky to say that. But these schools really are trying to sort on various qualities. Some of them are more like, are they likely to give money to our school in the future? But quite a few are actually things like, are you smart? Are you hardworking? And so I think that college can be considered an acceptable default plan if you don't have something specifically better to do. But I think that decision has to be more intentional. I think you have to actually look at your life and be like, no, college makes the most sense for me. And I don't think one should necessarily be structuring their childhood around getting into the best college. That seems like a level of back chaining that is very likely to destroy in childhood the thing that we need to actually sort of move the world forward.
It makes a lot of sense. Do you have any sense of why it has gotten so intense at the college level? I mean, this is not the case. They pretty much let everybody into Harvard in 1920 that could pass an admissions test. Yeah. It's pretty hard, but pretty much anybody could go. But this has completely changed in the last 100 years.
Yeah. I mean, so I do think the costly signaling cascades can become a runaway selection effect, right? Where it has sort of hit a point where, at least among certain strata of our society, you're considered a failure if you don't go to college.
Right.
And anytime you have a system like that, it starts to become a really negative signal to not go. Even if not going actually makes more sense and is actually better for you, it can hurt your life outcomes enough that you're sort of compelled to then try to go anyway.
Yeah.
And so I do think that those are competitive dynamics that can happen. Do I think that that's all of what's going on, though? I don't think that could be all of it. There has to be some underlying logic behind it. And I do think some of it is that college has basically been pushed on a financial level. It's been pushed on a social level. It's been literally sponsored by the government. You can get subsidized student loans to go. Once you start to see systems like that in place, then I start to be like, okay, someone's been messing with something here. It's this is not a sort of purely natural phenomenon. Right. So I think that's probably part of it. And then I actually think that I basically do buy the narrative that a lot of the kind of economic system in like the post-war era really started to kind of fall apart starting in the 70s. And if you look at so many different metrics, things either slowed down then or they started looking a lot worse then. And basically, I think what we're hitting is a world where there's a lot more competition for fewer sort of good outcomes in society. And in that case, I think you get a lot of parents who are seeing this and they feel economically precarious, right? They worry that their children are going to be worse off than them. And the one way to guarantee a good future for their children is you make them go to Harvard. I don't think that's true, but I think that's what's going on in people's heads. And so they are feeling like my duty as a parent, right, is to secure the future of my child. And the only way I can do that is by sending them to college. And to send them to college, it's so competitive and it's so hard. We have to be doing practice SATs from the time they're 7. Right. And some version of that, I think, has sort of clicked into place now. I am seeing forces that sort of counter this. I do think that the ability for people to, go to a coding boot camp and then get a job, right? I think the ability of folks to start a business themselves, these things have made it easier. And I think there are alternatives to colleges that are actually starting to look more viable. But we're only in the very earliest stages of that. And I don't know whether that's like a population level solution.
Yeah, maybe it's like works on like these edges, right? For, these specific careers. Maybe it's not enough for everybody. So you think it's something where like, we've got this like total factor productivity slowdown.
Yeah.
There's less opportunities. People like rightly sense something like this is going on. And so it's like, well, the best way you can kind of alleviate this is, well, the most legible path is, send your kid to Harvard. And so you do everything you can to get them there because that's kind of your duty.
Yeah, I do think that's a lot of what's going on.
That's really dark. But yeah, I think that's probably what's going on.
Sorry, man.
I mean, it's just the way it is, right?
I mean, I think we kind of live in some dark times. So, and it's weird too, right? Because like our whole social narrative is that we're living in this era of just unrivaled wealth and prosperity.
Yeah.
And I think in certain ways that absolutely is true. And yet we don't see that reflected in people's behavior. We don't see that reflected in folks' attitudes. And I think increasingly we're seeing it not reflected in the economic realities on the ground also. But I do think that, there does still have to be this case of like, maybe we're all just sort of crazy and life has never been better. I like that is a possible hypothesis that I haven't fully ruled out. And I should just mention that it's there because it does have some good arguments behind it. But like my felt sense is like we're entering a more difficult period and not a like unrivaled golden era period.
Definitely. Well, I think you're definitely on the money there. It's weird. Just if you look at the rates of like depression, how many people are on SSRIs? I mean, people are like very sad and lonely, and like if we're living in the best time in history, like why does everyone have to be on SSRI? It's like I don't know. Indeed. It doesn't make sense. Doesn't make any sense. Very, very weird. Well, do you see any like do you see any bright lights out of like our kind of general stagnation, or is it just going to be like this long, slow slide of decadence, for the next century or something?
I mean, we talked a little bit about that at the start, right? Where there could be something that sort of snaps us out of our complacency. It's very hard to know what that is before that actually happens. And I do think that if things get bad enough, then that produces forces inside of society to attempt some kind of change. Whether that's going to be a positive change or not, sort of remains to be seen. I basically think that forces society into high variance situations. And I know this sounds crazy to some people maybe, but I think the odds of like the US devolving into some sort of like fascist state is not like tiny.
It's kind of it's a rational response to like extreme bad times. That's generally how things go, right? I mean, you don't usually stay like a democracy for long when things are going not so hot.
Yeah, I think that it's easier to maintain a democracy as long as the pie is growing and there's a lot of gains from trade. But if everyone, rightly or wrongly, sees the world as being zero sum, then all of a sudden those sorts of deals don't look as good anymore. Because it's like, oh, well, this other person's just like trying to screw me somehow. And once you don't have scope for cooperation, people start to fall back on force. And I worry that that's the direction things are heading. I'm seeing more of a tendency towards, no, we actually just have to force this thing through. I am seeing that from everybody. I don't think this is actually just like, oh, the evil X or the, horrible Y. No, I see everyone sort of going slowly but steadily a lot more crazy and a lot more zero sum and more violent. And I do worry that this is kind of going to be the overall trend, at least for a while, until something turns things around or it goes much worse. But it's very hard to predict those kinds of things. And something that I think a lot about is if I were living through the 60s and 70s, would I be seriously worried that the entire world is about to collapse? And I think the answer is like, maybe, yeah. And like, maybe we almost did.
Right.
Like, how did we get through the Cold War without somebody nuking somebody? Like,
Yeah. Very
that
close.
seems
I mean, it's really
crazy.
close.
Yeah, it was multiple times, right?
Yeah.
So, there could be some sort of weird anthropics argument for why like all of us are still here and most universes were just some like smoking crater. Sure, that's possible. I think we probably weren't as close as people think we were, but we can definitely see that with the benefit of hindsight. And I can just see a lot of ways that like that period of global upheaval could have gone so much worse than it did. And then that sort of naturally leads me to this question of like, well, okay, if we could pull through the 60s and 70s, which in an objective sense were much more violent, much,
Right.
much, much more violent than today.
Yeah.
And they managed to sort of get out of that. So it clearly seems like there are ways to turn society around. I don't think once you've sort of entered a downward spiral that it's always a death spiral. The problem is that it's sometimes a death spiral and you don't really know at the time which one you're in or not.
It's right. It's very difficult to tell, like, and momentum matters, right? In these things, like, and that's what's kind of scary to me. It's like,
Yeah,
it's hard to reverse trend with things like this. It seems like.
totally. I think the sort of analogies to Rome are somewhat overdone, but there were multiple points throughout the history of Rome where you could argue that the whole system collapsed or that the system successfully renewed itself and lasted a few more centuries. So the final time that it fell apart, it really did fully collapse.
Right.
It seemed like it really was collapsing multiple times, and then it like revitalized itself into something arguably better, or at least arguably more functional for a long time.
Right.
And, as folks like to say, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. And it's really only easy to tell that you're in the terminal decline after the fact. There are some fascinating letters from the period of the actual fall of the Roman Empire, where you have folks saying like, yeah, the roads aren't really safe to travel right now. I'm hoping to visit you, next year when things have settled down.
Calm down.
Like, okay, well, obviously that didn't happen, right? But even the people who were living through the fall at the exact moment weren't even completely certain that it was over.
Couldn't see it.
And I do feel like there are just so many instances of this throughout history. So many times where there's been a massive social upheaval, an outright revolution. Every time I look at these case studies, I'm like, man, there were so many things wrong. And it seemed like there was this like tiny percent of the population that was basically parasitizing off of everyone else. And if they could have thrown them a bone, even like a tiny bone, they could have like stayed at the top of the hierarchy and, like ruled forever. And they just like couldn't figure out that they were just a hair's breadth away from literally being beheaded. Either it's that inherently hard to figure out, or those dynamics that they were so locked into, right, were just so overwhelmingly powerful that they couldn't steer the ship differently, even though they knew they were headed for certain doom. It's very hard to tell after the fact, but definitely at least contemporary writings in each of those cases, it seems like the people that were overthrown really were pretty disconnected and didn't realize they were just about to be killed.
Well, I'll give you this anecdote.